Hey guys, in this video, we are going to look at how to get started with a real graph database. We will look at Neo4j because it is one of the most popular graph databases, and we also use it here at Crosscode, just more familiar with it. There are a lot of other graph databases. If you search Wikipedia for graph databases, they list several of them here, including Neo4j, the DataStax, and others. However, for today's video, we will use Neo4j. Before we get started with some graph manipulation, I would like to talk about the various different ways you can use Neo4j for experimenting. The first way you can start using Neo4j is, of course, by installing it on your machine. So if you have a Mac OS or Ubuntu or Windows, search for how to install it on your machine, and Neo4j has good documentation on how to do that. There is a second way of getting started with Neo4j, and that is to install the Docker image. And there is also another page on the Neo4j website where it talks about how to install Neo4j using Docker. It comes down to ultimately running this command, docker run with Neo4j latest, and with a bunch of flags or parameters telling it which ports to expose on your machine, where to put the data, logs, and so on. I'm not going to go into the details of this. It's very well documented, so please install it based on the instructions here. The third method that you can use to install Neo4j or start playing with Neo4j is use Neo4j's hosted sandbox. And there are a couple of advantages of doing this. First of all, because it is hosted, you don't have to install anything on your machine. And the second advantage is that it comes built in with several play databases that you can start trying out. The disadvantage of using Neo4j sandbox on the web is that the sandbox lasts only 7 days. So Neo4j removes the sandbox after 7 days. That's something to keep in mind if you are into some heavy duty experimentation. But for the stuff that I'm going to show you, you can easily use the Neo4j sandbox on their site. The next thing to consider is Cypher Shell. Neo4j, of course, comes with a very nice user interface, which is once you run it on your machine, it's exposed on 7474, and it looks like this, where you can issue any of the queries that I will talk about, and it will give you a visual representation of the data in the database. However, I prefer this thing called Cypher Shell because it gives you command line interface to Neo4j and also lets you control exactly how you want to look at the data. I mean, you can do all of that using the browser interface too, but it's, I guess, a matter of preference. I just prefer the Neo4j Cypher Shell. Once you install Neo4j and the Cypher shell, you can start it like this, Cypher-shell, and it will ask you for the username password. The default is Neo4j, and it will give you a shell. The first command you need to know is, of course, help. And as you can see, there are a few basic commands here. The list is pretty short. I encourage you to look at all of this. Some of them are pretty self-explanatory, especially if you have used databases in the past. The first command that I would like you to learn is this command to look at the contents of the database. And that command is called match. The way you run that command is like this: match n, return space n, and semicolon. Every Neo4j command in the Cypher shell, and actually also on the web, has to end with a semicolon. Once you run this command, it shows you the contents of the database. And since we don't have anything in the database yet, it will show you an empty list. Now let's look at this command a little bit deeper and see what it does. The first thing to note here is this n. This n is variable. Match does is finds everything that is in the database and returns it one by one. And so what match does is matches your query with objects, and then I am returning n so that it is printed on the screen. Very similar to the yield function in Python or JavaScript, where you have an iterator and you yield one object at a time. That's the best way to think about the match command. And in fact, most other commands in Neo4j. The next command that you should know is how to clear the contents of the database. This is only for experimentation purposes, right? When you are experimenting, oftentimes you want to clean the database and start from scratch. So the command to delete the contents of the database comes in very handy. That also starts with match. So you do match n again, and this time instead of returning, you say detach, then delete n. Okay, and what detach does is for every node that is returned by match, it detaches the node from any other node. In other words, it deletes any edge that the node might have coming in or going out. And then finally, it deletes that node, right? Delete n does that. Now it says 0 rows available because we don't have anything in the database, so there was nothing to delete here. So let's get started with the real graphy stuff. The first command that you need to know about is create. And Neo4j allows you to create an empty node like this. So all you have to do to create a node is create followed by opening brackets and closing brackets, and of course the semicolon. When you do that, let's take a look at what it put in the database using our match return command. And you see that Neo4j created this empty node. One thing to note here is that the node does have an identifier, which Neo4j uses in the background. And you can look at the identifier using ID, the ID command, right? So you can see that the identifier of the node we just created is 48. This is an internal identifier. I like to see it to give each node a number, to associate a number with each node, especially when I'm trying things out. But this is an internal thing, and it is not recommended to use it in production, because if you delete that node, the ID can be reissued to another node. And then if you're using the same ID, then you might get into trouble. Let's modify the view command, match return command, to return not only ID, but also the node itself. It will look like this. So it gives you two columns here. First one is ID, and the second one is the node itself, okay? The next command I would like to show you is this one. If you have seen the last video, you'll remember that person is a label that we assign to our Bob node. And that's what we are doing here. We are creating a node with the label person. In graph databases, labels indicate the type of the node. For example, tomorrow, if you want to find out all the nodes of a certain type, you simply find, or rather match, all the nodes with has this label person. When you do that, you can see that it created a node with the label person. So let's continue on this path and add more stuff to this node. So how about we add a property name? So we'll add this name, Bob. And the way you add a property to the node is inside the curly brackets. And inside the curly brackets, the property or name value takes the form name colon value. So the value is string, you have to put in quotes. And the value is not string number, you can leave the quotes out. In our example, we'll create this node with name and age. If you do that, you see, okay, it created one node, and there you go. So you have the object number 50 with the name Bob and age 33. In other words, our Bob node. Let's look at how you can create relationships. So let's go back to the original node, which is an empty node. And to create a relationship using Neo4j, all you have to do is use this 2 dashes, an arrow to give it a direction, and another node. What this does is creates a relationship. Well, actually, this has a syntax error, and I'll tell you what it is in a bit. But this is the basic idea. To create a relationship between two nodes, you use the arrow syntax. So now if I do this, it will give me an error because it says, well, did you forget to prefix your relationship type with a colon? What it really means is that it wants you to give this edge a label. Remember from our last video that every edge needs a label and it can only have one label. The way you put a label on an edge is like this, using our colon method. Let's say you want to create a friend relationship between these two nodes. This is how you do it. On the left is one node, on the right is the second node, and there is a relationship of friend between these two nodes. You notice that there is this greater than sign at the end of this line, which indicates that this is a directed graph and the edge points from left to right. You can also, of course, point the edge in the other direction from right to left by just moving the less than symbol. In this case, this is the less than symbol to the left of the line. Let's look at what we created with our matching command. And it's not, the output is not very interesting because it shows you a bunch of empty nodes, but you can see the relationships like this. You can go to the browser interface and look at the graphical representation of that. So you can see we created a couple of blank nodes which are connected to each other. Let's take it a little bit further and create the entire example that we had in the last video. 2 nodes, one for Bob and another one for Alice, and the nodes connected to each other using this friend relationship with a couple of properties. Let's delete everything from the database, delete detach, make sure everything's gone. Yes. And then let's go back to our create command. Let's create our left-hand object, which is the Bob object. We'll put 2 labels on it, person and employee. Okay. Then we have our Alice object, who is also a person, and she is contractor. Then we, of course, have this friend relationship in between. And finally, we have some properties for both the nodes as well as the edge. So let's go and add them. The first property was name. So we'll do that. Second property was age, 33. Okay. Similarly, let's add the properties for Alice. Again, curly brackets, name, Alice. We make it a little bit smaller. I hope you guys can still see this. Alice, and for age 44. Okay. And finally, let's give the edge also a property. Again, that is done using curly brackets. So we will say strength, and we can say they are close friends. Okay, so let's see. Okay, it got created. Okay, and if you look at the contents of the database now, you will see two objects, 111 and 112, and or rather two nodes, 111, 112, and 111 is the Bob node, 112 is the Alice node. And if you look at the browser interface, you'll see how they are represented visually. So you have Alice here, you have Bob here, and then you have this edge between Bob and Alice, which is the friend edge. And if you hover over or select this here, you will see the property strength, which is close. So I will leave you with this today. As you can see, creating nodes and edges in Neo4j is as simple as using this ASCII art to specify labels and properties in the right places, and that's all you need to do. I hope this helps you get started with Real Graph Database, and in the next video we will look at how to import external data into the graph database. Thank you.